In a quiet town on the edge of the hills stood a magnificent house that everyone in the community admired. The house, almost like a palace, belonged to Mrs. Haja Mariam, a woman known for her wealth, generosity, and refined presence. With its spacious gardens, flowering trees, and marble walkways, her home was the pride of the neighborhood. Yet behind those tall walls and shining chandeliers lived a woman whose heart carried a weight of loneliness. 6 years earlier, her husband, Haj Mahmud, a successful businessman who had built their empire of trade and property from the ground up, had passed away from a sudden heart attack. Since that day, Mariam's life had changed completely. She still had wealth, influence, and respect, but she lacked what mattered most to her: companionship and genuine warmth. Her children, now adults with their own families, lived abroad, too busy with their careers to come home often. Their calls on the phone were polite, sometimes loving, but always formal. Never the kind of conversations that could soothe a mother's lonely evenings. Every morning she sat on her veranda, sipping tea and looking over her manicured garden. She remembered how she and Mahmoud would once sit together under the same shade trees, laughing, sharing dreams, and planning the future. Those days now seemed like distant echoes. Despite her active involvement in charity programs, community events, and social gatherings, she always felt like an outsider. She could give away millions, but she could not buy back the warmth of human affection. One late afternoon, as the golden sun dipped behind the hills, Mariam decided to take a short walk outside her garden. She rarely mingled with the neighbors, not because she didn't want to, but because her towering house and status had created a silent barrier. People respected her, but few truly connected with her. That day, however, fate led her to cross paths with someone unexpected: her neighbor, Farhan. Farhan lived in a modest house right next to hers, a sharp contrast to Mariam's palace-like mansion. He was a young man in his late 20s who had been living there with his widowed mother and younger siblings. His family was simple, hardworking, and quiet, but Mariam had never spoken more than a polite greeting to them. When she saw him that evening, he was carrying groceries in both hands, his clothes slightly dusty, his expression tired but sincere. For a moment, their eyes met. Farhan offered her a respectful smile and said softly, "Good evening, ma'am." Mariam paused. Something about the honesty in his tone, the gentleness in his manner, stirred a feeling inside her she hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't admiration nor pity. It was simply the recognition of a soul that worked hard and carried unspoken burdens. She found herself saying something she hadn't planned. "Have you eaten dinner yet, son?" The words surprised even her, but they came out naturally. Farhan blinked in surprise, then smiled faintly and replied, "Yes, ma'am, we just finished." "Thank you." His politeness touched her, but his tired eyes told another story. Mariam could sense he was hiding the struggles of his life, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a spark of human connection. That night, back inside her grand but silent home, Mariam sat in her study and wrote in her old notebook, the one she had not touched since her husband's passing. "Today, I spoke to my neighbor." A young man with kindness in his eyes. For a brief moment, I did not feel alone. The next morning, the sun filtered softly through the tall glass windows of Mariam's house. She sat at her breakfast table, sipping coffee, but her mind was not on the steaming cup in front of her. Instead, she kept remembering the brief exchange with her neighbor, Farhan, the evening before. It had been such a small moment, just a greeting, a few words, but it had left her strangely restless. She couldn't help but wonder about him. He lived so close in that modest house with peeling paint and a small front yard, yet she knew so little about him. The contrast between their worlds was so sharp: her sprawling mansion with fountains and wide gardens, and his simple home that seemed almost hidden in the shadow of her estate. Still, Mariam felt drawn to that simplicity, to the honest smile he carried despite the tiredness in his eyes. Later that afternoon, Mariam found herself standing near the fence that separated her house from Farhan's. She hadn't been outside this way in years, but something pushed her there. Just then, she noticed Farhan working in his small yard. He was watering the plants with a worn-out hose, his sleeves rolled up, revealing the marks of hard labor on his arms. He worked with a quiet determination, humming softly to himself as if trying to make beauty bloom despite the hardships. Mariam cleared her throat gently. "The flowers are looking lovely," she said, surprising herself with the comment. Farhan turned quickly, startled at first, but then offered her a polite smile. Thank you, ma'am. I'm trying to keep them alive. My mother loves flowers, and I want her to have something nice to look at. Miriam's heart warmed at his words. It had been so long since she had heard someone speak so simply and sincerely. She walked a little closer, leaning lightly against the fence. That's kind of you. Family is everything, isn't it? She said softly, almost as if talking to herself. Farhan nodded, his eyes reflecting both pride and responsibility. Yes, ma'am. They're all I have. My father passed away a few years ago, so I try to take care of my mother and siblings the best I can. The honesty in his tone struck Miriam deeply. She had wealth and influence, yet she often failed to keep her own children close. Meanwhile, here was this young man struggling, working tirelessly, yet never letting go of his devotion to his family. For the next few minutes, their conversation continued, small talk about gardens, weather, and daily life. It was ordinary, but for Miriam, it felt extraordinary. She couldn't remember the last time she had stood by her gate, speaking casually with someone who looked at her not as a wealthy benefactor or a figure of authority, but simply as a neighbor. When she finally returned inside her home, she felt a lightness in her chest she hadn't experienced in years. That evening, she wrote again in her notebook, I spoke to him longer today. His words are simple, but his sincerity fills the silence I carry. Why does this feel so important to me? The following days slipped by with an odd rhythm for Mrs. Haja Mariam. She kept herself busy with her usual routines, attending charity meetings, organizing donations, and overseeing her household staff. But her thoughts often wandered back to the neighbor next door. Farhan's tired yet sincere smile lingered in her memory like an unfinished story, one she was suddenly eager to read further. On the third morning, while she was seated on her wide veranda with a cup of tea, she noticed movement beyond her garden wall. Farhan was out early, fixing the wooden gate of his home. His shirt was slightly torn at the sleeve, his hair messy from work, yet there was an energy about him that caught Miriam's attention. He worked with focus, every nail hammered with patience, every board adjusted carefully. She admired how he carried himself, proud but humble, struggling but not defeated. Without thinking much, she stood and walked slowly toward the edge of her property. Good morning, Farhan, she called out, her voice gentle but carrying across the quiet street. He looked up quickly, clearly surprised to be greeted so warmly by the wealthy woman whose house loomed like a palace beside his own. Good morning, ma'am, he replied respectfully, wiping his hands with a cloth. Mariam hesitated for a moment, then asked, Do you usually do all the repairs yourself? Farhan nodded. Yes, ma'am. Hiring someone is expensive, and besides, I like to fix things. My father used to say, as a man must know how to mend his home with his own hands. I try to live by that. His words carried weight. They reminded her of her late husband, Mahmoud, who had always taken pride in building everything from scratch. For a brief second, Miriam felt the two men's spirits overlap, her lost companion and this young neighbor who echoed the same values. Moved by the thought, she said softly, Your father must have been a good man. Farhan smiled faintly, though there was sadness in his eyes. He was, ma'am. He taught me to work hard and never let my family go hungry. That's what keeps me going. The sincerity in his voice stirred something inside her. She realized she had been starved of such conversations, simple, honest words that spoke from the heart. For years, her world had been full of polite greetings, formalities, and business discussions, but not of genuine connection. That evening, the loneliness in her vast house felt heavier than usual. She dined alone at her long table, the silverware gleaming but untouched for long stretches. In her mind, she pictured the small dinner table at Farhan's house, where his mother and siblings likely shared laughter over modest meals. It was a picture of warmth she longed for but could not recreate in her mansion. Later, she opened her notebook once again and wrote, He reminds me of values I've almost forgotten. Hard work, family, sincerity. Why does his presence feel like sunlight breaking into my dimmed world? The next afternoon brought with it a quiet anticipation. Miriam had told herself she was only stepping outside to admire her own garden, but, in truth, she hoped to catch another glimpse of her neighbor. As she walked along the stone path lined with roses and bougainvillea, she saw Farhan in his yard again, this time helping his younger brother repair a broken bicycle. The scene was ordinary: an old bicycle, a rusty chain, and two brothers working together. But Miriam found it captivating. She stood by the fence, watching silently for a while. Farhan knelt on the ground, his hands stained with grease, explaining patiently to his little brother how to adjust the chain. His brother giggled at his own clumsy attempts, and Farhan laughed softly, correcting him with kindness. Unable to resist, Mariam finally spoke. "You seem to have a talent for fixing everything, Farhan." Farhan looked up, startled but pleased to see her. It's nothing, ma'am," he said modestly. "I just try to manage with what we have." Miriam smiled. Sometimes that is more admirable than having everything at one's disposal. Her tone was light, but her words carried meaning. Farhan's expression softened, as though he understood. The younger boy, noticing her, greeted shyly, "Good afternoon, Auntie." Miriam's heart warmed at the title. It had been years since a child had called her that so innocently. She leaned slightly closer and asked, "What's your name, dear?" "Hamid," the boy replied proudly. "This is my bicycle. Brother is fixing it so I can ride again." Mariam chuckled, her eyes twinkling. "You're lucky to have such a brother." As the boy ran inside to fetch a cloth, Mariam and Farhan found themselves in conversation again. This time it stretched longer than before. They talked about small things: the weather, the difficulty of finding good mechanics in town, the rising cost of groceries. Yet underneath their casual words was a growing sense of ease. Miriam no longer felt like a wealthy woman speaking down to a poor neighbor. She felt like a woman simply talking to another human being. When she finally returned indoors, she carried with her a strange glow. Her footsteps echoed less sharply in the grand hallway, and the silence of her home felt less oppressive. That night, she sat in her living room, listening to the faint sounds of laughter drifting from the neighbor's house. It reminded her of nights long ago when her own family had filled her mansion with voices and warmth. Taking out her notebook, she wrote with steady hands, "Today I saw not just Farhan, but his family. Their home is small, yet it feels alive. Mine is grand, yet it feels empty. Perhaps happiness does not depend on walls or wealth, but on the people who share them with you." She closed the notebook and placed it gently on the table, her heart restless yet strangely hopeful. For the first time in years, she looked forward to tomorrow. The days that followed seemed to take on a new rhythm. Mariam's mornings, once filled with silence and monotony, now carried an undercurrent of anticipation. She would sit by her window, sipping her tea more slowly than usual, her gaze unconsciously drifting toward the modest home next door. The sound of laughter, the sight of Farhan leaving for work with quiet determination, even the clatter of simple household chores from his yard, all of it felt like a balm to her solitude. One afternoon, while her staff were busy indoors, Miriam decided to step outside with a basket of freshly baked bread she had asked her maid to prepare. She told herself it was just a neighborly gesture, but her heart beat faster as she walked up to Farhan's door. She hesitated for a moment before knocking gently. The door opened and Farhan's mother appeared. She was a graceful woman with tired eyes but a warm smile. Mariam introduced herself politely. "I live next door. I thought I should bring something for your family." She held out the basket. Farhan's mother looked surprised but touched. "That's very kind of you, madam. Please, come in for a moment." Miriam stepped into their modest home, and at once she felt the striking contrast. The furniture was old but neatly kept. The air carried the aroma of simple cooking, and there was a sense of life here that her grand mansion lacked. On the wall hung faded family photos, and in the corner sat Hamid with his newly fixed bicycle, proudly showing it off to his younger sister. Farhan emerged from the small kitchen, wiping his hands. His eyes widened slightly when he saw Miriam standing in his home. "Ma'am, you didn't have to trouble yourself," he said, though there was genuine gratitude in his tone. "It's no trouble at all," Miriam replied softly. Your family is my neighbor, after all. I should have visited long ago. The conversation that followed was simple but heartfelt. They spoke about everyday struggles, about Farhan's work, and about how his mother worried over her children's future. Mariam listened intently, nodding, her eyes occasionally drifting to Farhan, who spoke with humility and respect. She felt something stir within her, a recognition of values she admired deeply: loyalty, responsibility, and sincerity. When Mariam finally returned to her mansion, her steps were slower, more thoughtful. She looked around at her vast living room, the chandeliers, the polished marble, the grand silence. It all seemed colder than ever after the warmth of her neighbor's modest home. That night, she opened her notebook again. I visited their home today. It is not rich, but it is alive. Farhan is different from the people I've known. He speaks from the heart, and his family's warmth fills a room in ways money never can. Why does being near them make me feel more human than I have in years? She closed the notebook, her hand lingering on its cover as if sealing away a secret. But in her heart, the truth was beginning to grow clearer. This was no longer just curiosity. It was something deeper. That evening, as the golden light faded from the sky and her mansion grew quiet, Mariam sat by the large bay window of her study. She gazed out at the neighboring house where Farhan's family gathered on the porch, sharing laughter over what looked like a simple meal. The sound of their voices drifted faintly through the night air, mingling with the chirping of crickets. She felt a pang in her chest, part envy, part longing. Her life was full of riches, yet so empty of the warmth she saw across the fence. For years, she had convinced herself she was strong enough to carry loneliness, that charity work and public respect were enough to fill the void. But now, watching her neighbor's family, she knew the truth. Her heart was craving connection, and it had found it in the most unexpected place. The next day, she found herself restless. She busied her staff with errands so that she could be alone. Walking into her own garden, she looked at the flower beds that had been tended by hired hands. The flowers were flawless, but lacked the joy she had seen in Farhan's small patch of soil. She crouched down, ran her fingers through the damp earth, and whispered, almost to herself, "Perhaps what I've been missing is not beauty, but meaning." Later that afternoon, she noticed Farhan outside, adjusting the roof tiles of his porch. Gathering her courage, she walked over to the fence. "Farhan," she called gently. He looked down from the ladder, smiling. "Yes, ma'am?" "Please," she said, "you don't need to call me ma'am. My name is Mariam." "You're my neighbor, not my servant." For a moment, he seemed uncertain, as though weighing whether it was proper. Then he nodded respectfully. "All right, Mariam." The way he spoke her name was careful, almost reverent, and it stirred a warmth inside her that made her cheeks flush. They talked for a while, about repairs, about his younger siblings' schooling, and about the rising costs of living. Mariam listened with unusual attentiveness. For once, she wasn't the wealthy donor offering solutions or writing checks. She was simply a woman hearing the worries of another human being. As the conversation ended, Farhan climbed down from the ladder and said softly, "Thank you for listening. Sometimes it feels lighter just to speak." Mariam returned to her house with her heart beating fast. In the solitude of her living room, she sat down heavily on the sofa, covering her face with her hands. "What am I feeling?" she asked herself. She was decades older than him, wealthy where he was humble, experienced where he was still young. It was unreasonable, even foolish, to let such emotions take root. Yet her heart defied logic. That night, she wrote in her notebook again. "He called me Mariam today. Just Mariam. For a moment, I was not a widow, not a donor, not a symbol of wealth. I was simply a woman, and I felt alive." The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of wet earth after a brief rain shower. Mariam sat on her veranda, the steam from her tea swirling into the cool air, but her eyes kept wandering to the modest house next door. The memory of Farhan calling her by her name, Mariam, still echoed in her mind, filling her with a strange sense of warmth and nervousness. She had lived for years behind a wall of formality, and now a single word had pierced through it. That afternoon, she found herself pacing her grand hallway, debating with herself. Should I invite him inside? The thought felt outrageous. What would people say if they knew she was entertaining a much younger neighbor in her home? Yet the emptiness of her vast rooms weighed on her like chains. She needed to hear another human voice echoing in her house, one that wasn't from her staff but from someone who truly saw her. At last, she decided. She asked her maid to prepare tea and simple snacks, instructing her to leave the tray on the table in the living room. When she noticed Farhan later, sweeping his yard, she gathered her courage and called out, "Farhan!" He looked up quickly. "Yes, Mariam," he said, the sound of her name on his lips again, bringing a flush to her face. "I was wondering," she began carefully, "if you have a little time, perhaps you could come in for tea. It would be nice to talk properly." Farhan looked surprised, almost hesitant. But after a pause, he nodded. "Of course. Let me wash up first." A few minutes later, he stood in her grand living room, his modest clothes contrasting against the polished marble and tall chandeliers. He seemed slightly uncomfortable, looking around as if afraid to disturb anything. Mariam smiled reassuringly. "Please, sit. This house is too big for one person. I'd be glad for your company." They sat across from each other, the tea tray between them. At first, the conversation was cautious. Mariam asking about his siblings' schooling, Farhan speaking humbly about the challenges of providing for them. But slowly, the caution gave way to something more natural. Farhan spoke about his late father, about how he dreamed of giving his younger siblings a better future. Mariam listened, her heart heavy yet admiring. "I envy your strength," she said softly. "You carry so much, yet you still smile." Farhan looked at her, sincerity in his eyes. "And I envy your kindness. Even though you have everything, you don't look down on people like me. That means more than I can say." Mariam lowered her gaze, her fingers brushing the rim of her teacup. For a moment, silence filled the room, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was warm, heavy with unspoken feelings. Later, as Farhan excused himself to return home, Mariam walked him to the door. She lingered as he stepped onto the porch, almost reluctant to let the moment end. When the door closed behind her, she leaned against it, her heart racing. That night, she wrote in her notebook, "He sat in my home today. His presence filled the silence that haunted me for years." For the first time, the house felt alive again. The days after Farhan's first visit felt different for Mariam. Her mansion no longer seemed like a tomb of silence. She found herself replaying the conversation in her mind, the way he had spoken about his family with pride, the way he had looked at her with respect untainted by greed or judgment. It had been years since anyone had sat across from her and spoken so honestly. Yet, along with this newfound warmth came a creeping uncertainty. That night, as she stood before her dressing mirror, she studied her reflection carefully. Her face still carried traces of elegance, her skin well cared for, her features refined, but she could not ignore the silver strands in her hair, the slight lines around her eyes. "Am I foolish?" she asked herself. "Am I too old to feel this way again?" But the next day, her doubts faded the moment she saw him. Farhan was tending his small garden when Mariam stepped outside. He looked up, his usual smile lighting up his tired face, and greeted her warmly. "Good afternoon, Mariam." The sound of her name spoken with such ease felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. "Good afternoon," she replied, her voice softer than she intended. She walked closer to the fence. "Your garden looks greener every day." Farhan chuckled. "It's nothing compared to yours." "But I suppose even small things can bring joy." Mariam found herself smiling back. "Yes, small things can mean a lot." The conversation continued, light at first, but soon drifting into deeper waters. Farhan spoke of his dreams, of wanting to one day own a small workshop to provide steady income for his family, to see his siblings study without worry. Mariam listened with rapt attention, her heart aching with admiration. He was young, but his words carried the weight of responsibility far beyond his years. That evening, unable to hold back the whirl of emotions, Mariam returned to her notebook, her pen scratched across the page. Why does his sincerity undo me so? Why do I long to hear his voice, to see his smile as if they are medicine to my weary soul? This cannot be mere kindness. It feels like something more, something I dared not believe I would ever feel again. But fear crept in alongside her confession. She imagined the whispers of society, the wagging tongues of neighbors, a wealthy widow falling for a man so much younger, and her own neighbor no less. The thought made her cheeks burn with shame, yet her heart refused to let go of the tenderness blooming within her. That night, she sat on her veranda staring into the distance. Across the fence, the lights of Farhan's home glowed softly. She could hear faint laughter and voices drifting into the night. In that moment, Miriam realized the truth she had been avoiding. She was no longer merely curious about her neighbor. She was falling for him, quietly, deeply, and irreversibly. The morning after their confessions, Miriam awoke with a renewed sense of purpose. For years, her life had been dictated by silence, loneliness, and duty. Now, for the first time since her husband's passing, she felt as though the world had opened a door she thought was permanently closed. Love had returned, not in the form she expected, but in one that made her heart feel alive again. Yet Mariam was not naive. She knew that emotions alone could not sustain a bond. Society would whisper, neighbors would raise their eyebrows, even her own children, far away though they were, might object to their mother choosing companionship with a much younger man. But she also knew this. She had lived too long by the rules of others. Now, she wanted to live by the truth of her heart. That afternoon, she called Farhan once again to her home. He arrived, respectful as always, though there was a gentleness in his eyes that made her feel less like a distant figure and more like an equal. They sat together in the quiet living room, but this time, the silence between them was filled not with uncertainty, but with hope. Farhan, Miriam said, her voice steady though her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I cannot hide our feelings anymore. If we are to move forward, it must be with honesty and dignity. I want this to be more than a secret between us. I want to make it real, with your family's blessing, and with mine. Farhan looked at her for a long moment, his eyes shimmering with emotion. Mariam, I never imagined someone like you would care for me in this way. But if you are serious, I will stand by you. My family, they will trust my heart. The following week, Miriam made the decision to cross the boundary that had separated their homes for years. She walked, not as a wealthy benefactor, but as a woman seeking acceptance into Farhan's modest home. His mother welcomed her warmly, offering tea with trembling hands, clearly moved by her presence. Miriam sat with her and spoke openly. I know this may seem unusual, she admitted, her voice gentle. But I love your son. He has given me back the light I thought I had lost. I ask for your blessing, not just for me, but for us. Farhan's mother listened, her eyes filling with tears. She looked at her son, then back at Miriam. If my child has found happiness with you, and if you are sincere in your care for him, then who am I to stand in the way? Love is rare, and if it has found its way here, I will not deny it. The blessing sealed their